something that can happen sometimes when you put together a service is if the music director and the rector don't talk about which hymns are going to be done at what time, sometimes the hymn can be very disconnected from the tone of the sermon. You might have a very rowdy hymn and the sermon is very quiet and meditative, or vice versa. I think occasionally sermons get a bit rowdy. You have something deep and meditative like this one. But occasionally, serendipitously, the music before the sermon and the sermon come together. This is a reflective type sermon, or at least I hope it's a reflective type sermon. There are different types. There are educational ones where I'm trying to teach a specific point or remind of a specific theological point. There are sermons that I hope are inspirational. There are sermons that I hope are challenging in the way we live our lives. But sometimes I like to just sort of do a sermon that's reflective, and that's today. It may also be inspirational or challenging, I don't know. That's up to you to do something with it. I'll tell you where it comes from. About a month ago, for those of you that didn't know this, there was an extraordinarily unusual event that happened in my life. In fact, it had never, ever happened before, and that was this. I was sick on Sunday morning. Since way before I attended seminary, I have never missed a Sunday morning in my life due to illness. In fact, sometimes I think that sometimes I wasn't doing much of a favor to the congregation by coming in anyway. But I guess it's about a month ago, there was just no way. And so I called up Jane, and I think I called up Bethany too, and asked if they could do a morning prayer service, because I just couldn't, there was it was just and so I stayed home and watched television church, which made me glad for St. Mary's. Not that it was horrible, but it's not me. And they did morning prayer. Well, that led to a little bit of a palace coup by the 8:30 people. After the 8:30 service was over, a number of the 8:30 people went up to Jane, I don't think Bethany, but went up to Jane and said, "Oh, it was so nice to have morning prayer. Do you think we could do it again?" And Jane, of course, being the soul of discretion and diplomacy, Amy smirking, her daughter, by the way, for those who didn't know that, one of them, two of them, well, she let me know that there was this thought, and I was asked if I was open to the possibility of this. Sure. And so this morning, we did what will be a regular monthly occurrence in the 8:30 service. We did the morning prayer service. And so what I wanted to spend the 8:30 homily time doing was talking about the rationale behind morning prayer. And the rationale as well behind having communion as the main Sunday service every week. I'm not going to re-preach that sermon because I want to go in a very different direction with the sermon of this service. But just to give it roughly in a nutshell, the communion is the act of corporate worship and devotion and sharing that Jesus commanded his disciples to do whenever they meet. It wasn't, if you think of it on the 5th Sunday of the month, or if you think of it on Sundays 1 and 3, somebody remembered to bring some bread and wine and just eat. It wasn't like that. It was very formal. It was in the context of the Passover service, or the Passover story that the people of Israel tell every year, up to and including now, is the story of God's leading of his people throughout the millennia. And in that context, Jesus introduced himself as a central figure in that story by breaking the bread and blessing the wine, sharing the wine with them. And he said to his followers, whenever you get together, do this. In other words, this is now, my sacrifice is now part of your story. So whenever you get together, do it. So when we do communion on a Sunday morning, what we're doing is stepping into the story. So I've used the word story 4 times now. And so what I just want to do is just sort of lead into where I'm heading with this is the importance of the story and the importance of our story, the importance of your story and my story. Okay, that's where I'm going with this. Because the rationale is because every one of us, our society, is one generation from forgetting the story. If this generation doesn't communicate the Christian story to the one coming along, it's going to disappear. That's it. And there are some things that's okay if they disappear. You don't really miss them all that much. But for those who have a faith and believe that God has revealed himself to us, and that with that revelation comes a new self-acceptance and a new call to holiness, to righteousness, and to serving others, to those that believe that the story comes with an obligation, it's important to pass that story on. Okay? And so, what I said to the congregation, I talked a little bit about community, I talked a little bit about community, very little bit, and I talked a little bit about the rationale for morning prayer. And morning prayer was a service that was, shorthand here, invented during the Dark Ages, in the emergence of the monastic movement, where literacy, education, health, art, it was the Dark Ages. Okay, so I don't want to say a lot about the Dark Ages, you know, right? They were pretty dark. Lasted for an age. But the monastic movement was one of the instruments of the preservation of what we would call good and cultural in that time. And part of that, of course, was not only preserving art and literature and literacy, but was the preservation of the Christian gospel and the Christian message later to come out again. And one of the ways in which the monastic movement preserved this was by creating different services. At one point there were 9 services said in monasteries and convents during the day. The first one was at 4 o'clock in the morning, and the last one was at 9 o'clock at night. And indeed, sometimes there was a watch service in the middle of the night, at midnight, and every time a service was being done, a bell would be rung, and even if people were sleeping, they would be woken up, and they would do their services 9 a day. And there were different acts of corporate worship. Some were singing praises, some were recitations, and some services were created, such as morning and evening prayer, that were telling the story. And that's being handed down to, in fact, in one way or another, virtually all denominations through the years. And indeed, in the Anglican Church, part of our history is when you're ordained as a minister, one of the oaths you sign is that you will say morning prayer and evening prayer every day that you're exercising the priestly ministry. One can interpret that rather loosely, but it's so important as a story determined to be that you promise to do that. And to hook that up with what does that mean practically, hearing the story, remembering the story, telling the story. If you look at morning and evening prayer in the traditional prayer book, what you'll see at the very beginning of the book is a list, year 1, year 2, of readings, morning prayer and evening prayer for every day of the week. If you do that, in 2 years, you will read everything there is to read in the Bible. And indeed, if you look at the services themselves, all of the canticles, all of the things that we sing, that we say in the morning prayer and evening prayer service are Bible stuff in themselves. So important was the story considered to be. And I got to tell you, maybe this doesn't sound facetious or overly light, but you know, when all is said and done at the end of the day, I doubt very much if you'll ever remember any of the theology of my sermons or anything like that. But I expect that maybe you'll remember 1 or 2 of the stories that I've told, whether they're personal stories or stories of somebody else that I've known, or just somebody that I've heard of. The stories are what communicate the truths as much as, or better than virtually anything else. So that's why we read Bible stories, and that's why I think it's a good thing that the 8:30 services said, let's do morning prayer occasionally, because it's a time to remember the stories and to, well, remember the stories, take them to ourselves once again. And so what I want to do is I want to spend about 10 or 15 minutes telling you stories, and then hooking them up. And the question obviously is, well, twofold. One, how do we do this at St. Mary's at our 10 o'clock service? How do we tell the stories and remind one another of stories? And it's also to ask the question, this is where the sermon ends, but it's not going to be over, don't worry. Don't vote. What's your story? You know, what's the story of how God has revealed himself in your life and changed you? A couple of stories. When I was preparing for the service this morning, the 8:30 service, I wanted to talk about how I came to understand the place of morning prayer in the church. My tradition when I grew up was very high Anglican. I was communing every single Sunday. To me, that was normative. And then I went to a church in Point St. Charles where morning prayer service was normative. And I asked the priest why. And he was a wonderful, wonderful, super guy. But his answer was, I don't know. Why don't you look it up? And so it began a process of me studying why Grace Church in Point St. Charles did morning prayer so often. I came up with something really fascinating. That in the olden days, that whole class of people, usually very poor immigrants, were the servants of people who lived up on the hill, in Westmount. And they would drive the people in the hillside, would drive the people on the hill to St. George's Church, Place de Canada. This is in the days of horses and carriages. And St. George's Place de Canada, the service was at 11 o'clock in the morning. And then left them 15 minutes to go down to places like Point St. Charles and Verdun for their service of morning prayer, which was shorter so that they could have their service and get back up to St. George's Place de Canada in order to drive the people home. That's where it started. Indeed, when I was doing that little bit of investigation, I came across and I found the story of Grace Church in Point St. Charles, where Bill White was, and where I was a student. And I was really surprised to hear the history of that. When you say Grace Church, you think something like grace, amazing grace, act of God grace. Nothing at all to do with that. The story, and this is very brief, the story is that before a church was built in Point St. Charles, there was the CN rail yards down there. You would well know that, Walter. Not that you were alive back then, you're not that old, but and what would happen is itinerant preachers would come by, some of them Anglican, some of the other denominations, Wesleyan, United Methodist, all the rest of it, because there was no church in that area. It was just an area that was growing up. And what they would do is they would borrow a CN boxcar, and the preacher would stand in the open door of the cattle car or whatever, and do the service from there, and preach from there. And people would gather in the rail yards. Well, after a while, CN wanted his rail yard back. And so what they did, because they didn't have the money to buy a church, this is a very poor area, what they did was they bought an old boxcar from CN for $1. And CN put it on a spur. And so that became the first church. Well, guess who paid the $1? What do you think your name was? Grace. And Grace. Mary. And so it became Grace's church. Well, I went back and I told Bill White that story. And so this is how Grace Church became Grace Church. So when they eventually built the actual church, they kept the name, right? And he thought this was fascinating. So from then on, I swear to you, this is true. It's a story, right? But it's true. Whenever he answered the phone, Bill White, the rector of Grace Church in Point St. Charles, would answer, Grace's Church. That's how he would answer, because it was indeed Grace's Church. So story is important, history is important, where it comes from is important, and what we allow ourselves to forget has something to do. What we allow ourselves to forget. I've got a couple of other stories I want to share with you this morning. Some of you will remember this one. When I was in seminary, and this all comes from dealing with morning prayer and a rationale for morning prayer, and it starts me remembering, when I was in seminary, it wasn't the happiest time of my life. I went into seminary and I expected it to be a very positive, supportive, faith-building place. That was not my experience at seminary. My experience of theology and McGill was not the most positive either. I'm not an academic. If I force myself, I can. My marks aren't terrible if I actually choose to apply myself. They did give me a degree, and stuff like that. So I got credentials. Anyway, but it didn't turn me on. It wasn't where I was at. Where I was at was people. And I got to tell you, I got to meet some spectacular people and hear some absolutely amazing stories. One of them is this. One afternoon I'd taken a nap, as I often did in those days. When I woke up from my nap, I went next door to one of the other rooms in the seminary because the guy always had a pot of coffee on. His name was Erasmus Biterabeho from Uganda. He was a prince of his tribe, and his dad was a king. So, I have met royalty. Not very impressive. He's a nice guy. But he had a visitor, and the visitor had a purple shirt on. And this was one of the biggest men I had ever seen in my life. This guy was huge. He was over 6 feet tall, and 6'6", over 6.5 feet tall, and he was a big man, when Erasmus introduced us, he shook my hand, and my hand disappeared inside of his hand. This was a huge man, and it was Erasmus's bishop at that time. He was doing a tour in North America during the regime of Idi Amin. Some of you may remember the regime of Idi Amin. Horrible, horrible thing. And we talked for a little while, and then I, typical, my social graces, I said to him, it's really nice talking to you, it's time for supper. Really nice talking to you. I hope we can meet again sometime. And he leaned back and he laughed. He went, oh, that's not going to happen. Not a usual thing you expect to hear a person say. He knew what was going to happen to him when he went back to Uganda. And what happened when he went back to Uganda was he was met at the airport by the security police, charged with his protection. And on the way back to his residence in Kampala, the Jeep that he was in accidentally had an accident and overturned and he was killed. Nobody's quite sure where the bullets came from in that accident, but he was assassinated. He was murdered by the new regime for doing what he was doing, which was talking about the horrors of the Amin regime. That precipitated such a backlash, such a global backlash, and also a local backlash, because he was loved and respected, that the Amin regime was from then on doomed to fall. And it did, a short time later. Uganda's story since then has not been pretty, but it is not as it was when Yehudi was there. This man, he knew, standing in room 23, I think it was, Montreal Diocesan Theological College, talking with one of his clergy, Erasmus Rodoveo, and his second or maybe first year student, I can't remember, Lorne Tardy. He knew that when he got off that plane, he would not leave to see the sunset. I have met a martyr. Who so internalized the notion of Christ's sacrificial love that he sacrificed his own life to accomplish a greater good. I've met a martyr. He was a holy man. He was a good man. He was a man who died way too young. But it was an unbelievably powerful witness to me to the truths of the gospel. At a time when I was learning theology in academia, and it just wasn't touching me. The story is important. This past week at youth group, and again, this is the story, and it's probably one that y'all know, and you don't need to be reminded of. But we were spending some money, and we spent $1,000, just over $1,000 at youth group on Thursday. It's after Easter, late night. I thought there was only going to be a couple of them. Turned out to be more than that. Took the laptop out of the kitchen, plonked it on the coffee table in the living room, and brought up Kiva. Just in case anyone that doesn't know what Kiva is, microcredit loans to people who otherwise would not get money from banks, particularly women, et cetera, in developing countries. And I reminded those who were there and told those who were too young to be a part of youth group at the time how we got involved with Kiva. And the story goes like this. Every now and then I do something right. And this was one of those nights at youth group. We don't usually do Bible study at youth group. Personal faith and spiritual development tends to be on a, 2 or 3 at a time, or even on an individual basis. Youth group is the gathering place, where you bring them in. But this particular night, and it's 5, maybe even 6 years ago now, I read a Bible story to them. There was the story where there's the sheep and the goats. You all know that story, I don't need to tell it to you, right? There's the sheep and the goats. And there's this big separation that happens. And the goats go, wait a second, this is not fair. Jesus, if we'd known it was you, we would have taken care of you. And then he says to the sheep, who are there going, why us? And the point of the story is, look, you're feeding the hungry, you're clothing the naked, you're visiting people in prison, you're healing the sick, you're doing it. As you do it to the least of these, you're doing it for me. So come on in. And so I read the story to them, which I just mercilessly paraphrased. And I said, so here's the question, folks. How can you live that in your life? Now, part of the reason why I wanted to do this exercise with them is because it has become trendy in our school system, and I think it's a good thing, to get kids to do community service hours, But one of the things that's lacking is why? why it's important to do these community service hours. Why are you doing this? And so I get to deal with all the kids all the time who are just asking me to sign their little book without the faintest reason being given to them why they're supposed to do this. And so it just becomes another burden to them. And so with that kind of things going on, I told a story and I asked them the question, how can we live this in your lives? Like, what does this mean? How can we apply it practically? And the living room at the Tardy house where youth group takes place was deadly silent. And so I invited them upstairs. Phil was there that night. Invited them upstairs to the computer, and I brought up Kiva. And okay, loans that change lives. And we started scrolling through all the people who were asking for loans and what that loan would mean to them. And if Bethany was here, if Bethany was here, she would remind me the exact number. I can't remember whether it was $100 or $150 that I had originally agreed to lend them, which they would have to do a fundraiser then to pay me back. Well, we spent that first amount of money, and then after that, they couldn't stop. They were looking at all these people. And that night, they spent $1,500 on my Visa card. And it was like, are you guys serious? Like, you're going to have to repay this. They had to repay within a few months. And then did another $2,500 on Kiva. As you've done it for the least of these, you've done it also for me. That's how our youth group got involved in the social justice field. Before that, we weren't. The occasional little thing. But that's an important story. Because Jesus has never changed his mind about the fact that we are called, among other things, to care for the poor, the hungry, the sick, the marginalized, the unloved, the unwanted. He has never changed his mind on that. And by the way, charity begins at home is found nowhere in the Bible. Okay? And even if it's a good phrase, maybe it begins at home, but it sure don't have to. It sure shouldn't. So anyway, that was the beginning of the story. That led to other things. I'm going to tell you another story. It's another one that you know. I'm not an iconoclast. I think our structures are important. They're important for what they make possible, even though structures have issues. And the church structure sure has issues. But every now and then it seems to me that the Spirit of God works even within a flawed, failing structure to accomplish something good. And this is a story about that. On a particular day, we were supposed to have what's called a dean chapter meeting, and that's representatives, the clergy, wardens, treasurers, and synod delegates of every parish in our geographic area getting together to talk about issues of mutual concern. And so it was to be hosted by St. George's St. Anne's Bellevue. The publicity wasn't exactly great, the enthusiasm was even less, and so it was a very, very poorly attended meeting. But the person who was there, her name is Gladys Williams, who was the head of Action Refugee Montreal. And she was invited to come and do a presentation on the issue of refugees. There were two people from St. Mary's there. One was me, and one was one of our deputy wardens, Bethany Hardy. She was sitting on my right, and there were some other people there, some really terrific people. And Glennis was presenting the need. And also saying that that year was the 50th anniversary of the Conference World League Development Fund, and that he had challenged Anglican parishes across the country to get together and to sponsor 50 refugee families for 50 years. And Glennis put that challenge out and said, is there any way the churches of the west side of the could sponsor a family? I looked at Bethany. Bethany had a very Bethany look in her eyes. And if you've ever seen Bethany when she's focusing on something that she will accomplish, there's a particular look she gets. You all have your looks too, by the way. And I was just sort of sitting there thinking, how do I push the button on this one? That's it. Well, after the meeting was over, I was chatting, and Bethany was standing talking to Glennis Williams and Sue Wynn from St. George's St. Anne's Bellevue. And I didn't know how, it was going to happen, or who was going to make it happen, or the structure, or anything. But when I saw the three of them having that conversation, I knew somewhere in the world, there was a family that was going to become a family. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind. These are, like, you will not be surprised to know that I like being surrounded by strong people. I enjoy strong women. I mean that in a good sense of the word, and no facetiousness here. And there were three of the most powerful, strong women that I know. Lennis, Bethany, and Sue Wynn. And if you didn't agree with them, just stay away. But of course people did agree with them. And less than a year later, Lanier, Rona, and Solar came to Canada to experience a very, very different life than the life they had experienced. Later on, for reasons that we could discuss in the Cows Company, they chose to move to Vancouver. But we set out to give a family in desperate danger a new chance. Started life in Canada, and we did it. And of course, the leftover money ultimately led to another story. I get an email saying that our leftover money has gone to a church in Nova Scotia who's short of funds and want to reunite a family, but they've already sponsored 5 families, they have no money, so this is going to help them. So I end up talking to Sharon McLeod, how much do you need? $10,000. Youth group, what do you think? Sure, let's do it. And there will be another family reunited in Canada because of our youth group research. That's stories. So, my time is at an end. I just told you a couple of stories. Would you believe that I have a few more that I can tell you? And I'd love to tell you, but there isn't time. And it's also not all that important that you hear all my stories again and again and again, even though a lot of them are really stories of how I've seen God's grace working. But what's really important is that we hear each other's stories. I know some of your stories. We need to start telling the story. As I was thinking of how I wrap this up, I was thinking of a bunch of other stories. I was thinking, for example, we remember baptism. And I remember that. Of course you remember that. You were 13 or so, whatever. We had a lovely, lovely service. And in the context of that service, everybody had a candle. And we sang a song that was Ubi Caritas from Teze. And everybody's candle was lit. And there was a lot of stuff that was planned. There was one thing that was absolutely spontaneous that is etched in my memory. Everybody left the church singing Ubi Caritas and lined the hall, all the way down the hall to the parish hall, with their candles lit as a group came out on our baptism day. What a glorious thing that is. And there's so many more stories. Folks, we've got to tell our stories. We are one generation from the gospel being forgotten. If we don't tell the gospel, it's going to be lost. And the best way we have as individuals to tell the gospel, to share the gospel, is by talking about how God's grace has worked in our lives. Our liturgy is important. The stories as we read them in Scripture are important. But if the children are to know, if next generation's children are to know, it'll be because this generation has told them. And so I think once a month, starting in May, we're going to have